We do. I just thought I'd ask James to speak to the committee. James's family has been going through a really difficult situation, and some of us kind of have been a little bit more involved than others. But I thought, James, give you a minute to update the status on your grandson.
I wasn't expecting to say much. Just that our 8-month-old grandson, Jack, had open heart surgery about 9 days ago. So he's had complications ever since, RSV infection, now pneumonia, and UTI. So he's in a fight. So just asking for prayers and everybody's best wishes.
Thanks, James. Anyways, for those of us who have kids and grandkids, this is very difficult to deal with. So thoughts and prayers. And thanks, James, and all the best. So with that, we are. I'm calling to order the meeting number 51, the Standing Committee on Defense, and we adopted a motion on February 10th to get a briefing today from on high altitude surveillance balloon from the People's Republic of China, and of course I anticipate that we'll go into subsequent events as well. And with us we have Lieutenant General Alan Pelche. Good to see you again, sir. You're very familiar with the committee. And Major General Prevost, again, I think we're going to start issuing frequent flyer points for you, sir. So we appreciate your attendance here this morning. With that, I'm going to ask, I'm assuming, Lieutenant General Alain Pelche for an opening 5-minute statement.
Okay, bonjour, Monsieur le Président.
Good morning, Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today.
15 seconds to actually pass our best wishes to Mr. Bazin and his family. Having lived similar circumstances, I can only empathize with what you're going through. Je suis.
I'm Lieutenant General Alain Peltier and Deputy Commander, North American Aerospace Defense Command, at headquarters at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs, Colorado. As Deputy Commander of NORAD, I support the Commander of NORAD, U.S. General Glenn D. Van Herk, in the execution and functions of NORAD missions, responsibilities, and functions outlined in the NORAD Agreement, aerospace warning, aerospace control, and maritime warning, and associated NORAD terms of reference. Joining me in today's virtual appearance is Major General Paul Prévost, Director of Staff, Strategic Joint Staff.
Monitors the approach to North America across all domains. Over the past weekends, or over the past 2 weeks, we have detected, identified, monitored, and engaged a PRC high-altitude surveillance balloon and other objects across North American airspace, activities that are well aligned with our mission of aerospace warning and aerospace control. This balloon and the 3 following objects were not operating in accordance with standard aviation requirements, were not transmitting their positions, and were not in communications with air traffic control agencies. Following standard NORAD procedures, fighters and air-to-air refueling aircraft were scrambled to locate, investigate, identify, and characterize these radar contacts. So at the direction of national leadership, 4 objects have been taken down over U.S. and Canadian airspace within respective sovereign airspaces and territorial water in order to protect the population while maximizing the ability to recover the debris. That is the PRC high-altitude surveillance balloon taken down on February 4th, an object over Alaska on February 10, a suspected balloon over Yukon on February 11, and another object over Lake Huron on February 12. Tout au long de ces récentes
Throughout these recent operations over North America, Canadian and American personnel from the Canadian, Alaskan, and continental U.S. NORAD regions successfully detected, tracked, positively identified, and monitored the high-altitude surveillance balloon and the subsequent 3 objects. For each of these objects, NORAD had further discussions with the U.S. and Canadian leadership on the risk the objects posed to national security, to civil aviation, to our civilian populations, and to infrastructure on the ground and waters.
action and employ weapons. We also carried out a risk assessment for collateral damage to potential boats and mariners, our infrastructure, as well as people on the ground. NORAD personnel have planned and executed their mission exactly like we've been doing it over the last 65 years. And we work collaboratively with interagencies and interdepartment partners to ensure public safety throughout. The detection, tracking, and monitoring of these objects have highlighted some challenges for NORAD. Some of these objects have been small in size, slow in speed, with low radar cross sections. This makes them difficult to be detected and tracked on radar, challenging to locate with airborne assets, and difficult to categorize. NORAD works every day to improve domain awareness by integrating intelligence and sensor data and reviewing previous data to improve and help us see more. While these objects may not have showcased hostile act or hostile intent, their paths in proximity to aviation routes, populated areas, and sensitive defense infrastructure have raised concerns. Donc, il y a beaucoup de choses que nous...
There is much we do not know about the high-altitude surveillance balloon, and more so about the 3 subsequent objects. That's why Canada and the U.S. are hard at work recovering the debris to better understand their nature and purpose. Through intensive efforts in Canada and in the U.S., interagency teams are putting in intensive work to locate, find, and collect debris for further investigation.
Solution, as we've seen during the recent events, the threat to North America has rapidly evolved from a northern approach, long-range aviation, to a 360-degree threats, and from all domains. I believe this is the first time in the history of NORAD that Canada or the U.S. have actually taken kinetic actions against an airborne object in Canadian and American airspace. And it is important that we maintain the necessary capabilities to continue to do so. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to address the committee, and I look forward with Jean Prévost to address any questions.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Bazan, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the kind words, General. Good to see both General Pelche and General Prévost back at committee. And I just want to first and foremost thank you and all the Canadian Armed Forces and everyone at NORAD for their efforts over the past week and a half dealing with these flying balloons and other objects that have been causing so much uproar within the media, but also in the general public as well. So we know that the last 3 balloons that were shot down look to be more benign in nature, but we won't know that till recovery efforts have taken place. But in your professional opinion, what was the intended purpose of the first surveillance balloon? And will you confirm that it was launched from the People's Republic of China?
Thanks, Mr. Chair, for the questions. We have assessed that the first balloon was launched from the PRC and is in fact a high altitude surveillance balloon. And that's the balloon that we're talking about that was actually shut down on the 4th of February. And the balloon that we were able to actually track across the skies of Alaska, Canada, and the U.S. as well.
So U.S. lawmakers, as well as some in the U.S. military, has said that that first balloon flew over multiple U.S. military bases and nuclear missile installations. Can you confirm if the balloon also traveled over any Canadian Armed Forces bases?
Yeah, I can tell you that we NORAD here monitored the flight path of the balloon for most of its flight path over Canada, as we experience, as has been discussed in the media, some radar gaps throughout some of its flight path. And as far as the actual oversight location, the high altitude surveillance balloon of the PRC came in proximity to some of the Canadian bays, but I cannot speak of the actual response of those Canadian bays. And if you allow, I'll turn to General Prévost to potentially address that aspect of the question.
General?
I can surely do that. And first, Mr. Bazan, our thoughts and prayers, courage to your family, your grandson, yourself. You've been always a fan of the members of Canadian Forces, and we'll keep you and family in our thoughts and prayers. So to answer the question, the high altitude balloon that was actually launched from China that came through flew over Canada around 31st of January. It came down pretty much from Alaska down into Yukon and into central BC. So pretty much between the border of Alberta and the coast. There was no Canadian Forces infrastructure of significance along its path. So if you can just picture a line straight down the middle of BC.
Okay, so far went where our bases were stationed through Alberta, and it didn't go far enough west to go over Comox and just climb. Okay,
that's correct.
So when we're looking at these balloons that are being launched by the People's Liberation Army, what type of threat do they pose to Canada beyond the issue of surveillance equipment?
Okay, thanks, Mr. Chair, for the question. The threat is currently being assessed. Obviously, the main considerations for the first, the high altitude surveillance balloon from the PRC, our main concern was around its collection ability based on the quantities of sensors that were assessed to be on board. As it relates to the other objects that have been detected in the skies and for which NORAD is responsible, the assessment is yet pending. In order to actually have a better characterization of the capabilities of those objects, we're going to need, in order to actually put our hands on the systems that have been down, in order to actually better analyze the capability that came with those objects.
Are you aware, both from the standpoint of Canadian Armed Forces and NORAD, that it's been reported on Chinese state television going back to 2018 that the People's Liberation Army have been testing high-altitude balloons as a launch platform for hypersonic glide missiles, as well as electronic magnetic pulse weapons?
Thanks, Mr. Chair, for the question. From my, I guess, access to intelligence here, I'm not tracking those capabilities being tested right now by the PRC. Maybe General Prévost, do you have? General Prévost, do you have anything to add there?
Maybe the one thing I would add, Mr. Chair, is that when we were aware of those capabilities, the capabilities of the balloons, exactly what they can do and cannot do. We're still trying to get essay on this. If you've seen the balloon, there's quite a scaffolding of arrays that was hanging off it. But what I'll say is General Van Herk, Commander NORAD, when he was first made aware of those balloons approaching North America, his first mission was to go and investigate what he could see on that array there to ensure that there was no weapons, no kinetic effects that could be delivered. And we had a good confidence at that point that that was not the case.
I'm sorry, Mr. Brezan, I'm going to have to cut you off at this point and turn to Mr. Souza for 6 minutes.
Mr. Chair, and thank you both for your presentation. We reference origin of the balloon from China, yet there's some uncertainty, I guess, in terms of the subsequent ones. I guess President Biden referenced the fact that maybe the last 3 objects were mostly likely balloons tied to private companies, recreation, or research institutions studying weather or conducting scientific research. And if that's the case, do you have a sense? Are you following the origin of those balloons?
Thanks, Mr. Chair, for the question. And right now, obviously, as I pointed out earlier, we have an understanding of the origin of the first IL-2 surveillance balloon. Right now, during the intercept time and going back with the data that was available off of the radar, we've been unable at this point to actually ascertain or pinpoint the origin of the other balloons. Some of them have actually entered the airspace via the Alaskan NORAD region, but the others that has been detected in Lower Canada transiting into the U.S. Was the first indications on radar of the objects traveling across the airspace. So that's why collecting or actually recovering the objects that are on the ground is important, so that we can not only characterize the capabilities, the threat that it poses to North America, but also the origin and hopefully the intent behind such a launch and capabilities.
Yeah, thank you. And as you know, involved with NORAD as you are, and the modernization proposals being put forward, the $40 billion to be invested going forward over 20 years, do you foresee a need to reassess some of those plans given your recent initiatives with NORAD?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Mr. Chair. Obviously, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, NORAD is an evolving organization. We always attempt to actually remain relevant, not only to the Canadian government, to the public, but also to our allies, and most importantly, to the potential adversaries. So we're always looking internally to look at, do we have the right capability? And this is where NORAD modernization is going to help. It's going to actually provide enhanced sensors to increase our air domain awareness against the evolving threat that exists out there, that are mainly that may be mainly coming from Russia and China, but also from other potential countries. The additional piece is strong, secure, and engage is going to be providing additional capabilities to our capabilities that are available to NORAD, and that is the F-35 that has been recently announced, as much as the strategic tanker capability that is going to give us increased reach and increased capacity across our areas of operation.
Yeah, all of us around this table, all of us, frankly, in the news and so forth, are concerned about the security threats that this may pose, but also the civilian threats. And I think that's been cited as being part of the aviation concerns. Do you foresee any other engagement, or how do you find these balloons providing any kind of civilian concerns?
Yeah, thanks for your question, Mr. Chair. One of the main, I guess, concern, aside from potential surveillance and characterization of the objects and balloon, was also to civil aviation, given the fact that the last 3 objects were transiting through U.S. and Canadian airspace at altitude at which other commercial airlines actually travel regularly, especially those coming across the pound, as we call it, coming across the Atlantic and the Arctic from Europe, or making their way to Europe. So it was a concern, and that was one of the considerations from both government before taking actions against those objects.
Thank you, gentlemen. Well, that's great. So when we talk about the threat of from China or Russia, and trying to determine how many of these balloons are actual research balloons or hobby balloons, do you have any hope of recovery on some of those balloons that have been brought down? to determine if that's the case?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Mr. Chair. I'll turn to General Prévost to answer the recovery aspect.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. This is going to be a difficult operation. Both the one over Lake Huron, which is the third one of the small objects that were shut down, the U.S. Coast Guard was in charge of that operation, and they've ceased their recovery effort given the small chance of finding anything there. On the other one in Alaska and in Yukon, they're fairly up north in very difficult terrain, lots of snow. The one in Yukon specifically landed in the mountainous terrain with about 1 meter to 1.5 meters of snow. Picture an object falling from 20,000 feet into that snow. We're doing everything we can right now. I can tell you we have about 130 members of the Canadian Armed Forces. And right now I'm answering for the RCMP. Unfortunately, they couldn't meet us today. That's their operation, but we're supporting the RCMP in this one. 130 members of the Armed Forces are there. We have multiple platforms. The first part is to find what we can by aerial search. We had a CP-140 on site. We now have a Hercules, a Cormorant, a Cyclone, 3 Griffins. If we ever find something, then we have also a task force, about 70 members, mainly from the Special Forces, but also working with the Canadian Rangers that will be able to find their way to what we call the find area to extract it. It's still important effort until we find one of those 3 objects, and now 2 objects, one in Alaska and one in Yukon. Until we find them, we'll never be very sure of what those arrays were.
Thank you, Mr. Souza. Madame Desbiens, bienvenue au commentaire.
Ms. Desbiens, welcome. 6 minutes, please. Thank you, Chair. First of all, on behalf of Quebec, I wish to offer to Mr. Bézin our support and our thoughts, and I'm sure that all of that will work out well, and we are with you in our thoughts. Mr. Prévost, Mr. Pelletier, thank you for being there. It's always very interesting. My father was passionate about military intervention and the armed forces, so as a result, I was also made very much aware of that from a young age, so I feel it's a privilege for me to be here this morning to share this with you. Thank you for being with us. Mr. Pelletier, you said earlier that it was the first time that measures were taken in such circumstances. Is this a sign that we need to become better prepared for these kinds of interventions and situations? Thank you, Chair, for the question. Obviously, to repeat the words that General Van Herk uses regularly, the global environment, the security environment, globally speaking, is becoming increasingly demanding, not only for us, but also for our allies. And we have seen the threat evolve. So what I have done here through the consultations this week with my colleagues in Ottawa, as well as with the organization, is to look into what this represents, a little bit like the evolution of the Cold War through to September 11th, when we saw a change of paradigm toward a threat that could come from within. And we're looking at objects now that represent a challenge for national defense, for NORAD, not only due to the speed and altitude that some of these objects operate at, but also the small radar reflection surface. So these are things that we take into consideration and that we also look at in terms of what are the rules that surround our operations as to whether we ought to change some of these rules to enable us to have greater flexibility operationally speaking. Thank you. That's very interesting. We've been told, or you have told us, that the balloons shot down seemed different. Can we imagine that it's because they had different roles or possibly different origins? Are you able to give us some indication about that? Thank you, Chair. Of course, one of the aspects that is of interest is to categorize, as I mentioned earlier, we intercepted these objects. We have tried to get a certain visual information from it because of the slow speed of these objects as compared to the high speed of fighter planes. There's very little time to observe the objects, and in the light conditions, particularly for the first and second objects last week, where the lighting conditions were not optimal. So we saw, like the one in Yukon, it appeared to be a balloon, potentially a balloon, but the other objects appeared to be a structure. And this is why we want to have an opportunity to capture these objects, to use that term, and to analyze them to see whether it's a balloon or some other type of object, let's say of a type of drone, in order to get a better understanding of their capacity and origin as well. Thank you very much. Along the same line of concern regarding the effectiveness of NORAD, 130 members out in the field, is that enough? And does the time factor play against us in order to obtain better information? Thank you, Chair. I'm going to let Jean Prévost deal with the recovery aspect. Thank you. Is 130 members sufficient? As I mentioned earlier, the search effort is an aerial search with 6 aircraft out in the field with a number of different types, with surveillance lifts to find something in the snow, which is what we call a needle in a snowbank rather than in a haystack. It's hard to locate, but all efforts are being deployed. We've put out all the effort we can on the site to try to find the object from the air, to see something that may have remained, whether it's the structure of the object or some electronic components. First of all, to find out what capacity these objects may have had, and secondly, their origin. All efforts are underway, and as I said, we have a team of 70 people on the ground ready to respond once we locate the object in order to recover the object in the conditions of the site, of course. In the Yukon, it's very cold. At present, we have about 150 centimeters of snow cover in the mountains, which is also a wooded area, and we also expect snow, which is a concern. The more there's snow, the more the components can be buried. So we're doing all the efforts we can rapidly to try to fight against snow expected early next week. Thank you.
Thank you to both the witnesses for being with us today and for your service. I wanted to, just for clarity's sake, General Pelletier, you mentioned the reason that these objects were suspect or potentially an issue. They weren't communicating in standard formats. They weren't acting regularly. Can you better explain or go into a bit more detail what you meant by that? But also, my curiosity is sort of around. It seems like all of a sudden we have these 4 objects. When you say that they weren't using regular techniques or regular communications or acting regularly, what other types of regular communications, regular typical objects do we often see? Is that more of a typical thing? Could you explain a bit more about that?
Okay, thanks, Mr. Chairman, for the question. So can definitely amplify here. So as I mentioned, our task is to detect, track, identify, characterize, and then from there assess the threat related to any unknown tracks coming across the NORAD airspace within the NORAD areas of operation. As part of that, our folks on the grounds are using sensors, mostly radar sensors, to actually detect anything that may be on the approaches of North America, but also leveraging sensors for what may be in the airspace. The reality is the size of Canada and the U.S. doesn't allow for a full coverage of the airspace because we've got a huge landmass. And in this case, normally we're going to actually we're going to have an ability to actually detect the standard air traffic that is traveling that would normally communicates with the air traffic controls, would be squawking, and that is transmitting a code that would be picked up by the air traffic control to identify the aircraft itself. In the case of general aviation, that is just what we call a 1200 squawk, saying I'm a general small aircraft operating in the vicinity of a location. In this case, and I haven't actually gone into the book to look at the exact Transport Canada or Federal Aviation Administration in the US for the specific regulation, but I know that balloons or other objects ought to be transmitting a position location so that and an altitude location so that we can actually have a discrimination between them and potential air traffic, and to avoid and to enhance safety as well. In this case, those objects and the high altitude surveillance balloon of the PRC were not in communications, were not squawking, and therefore were unknown to us. And that's why we, first of all, took action to identify, and then because of the threat that they pose to civil aviation, which was a concern to both governments, we elected to actually take them down under the directions of both governments.
Okay. In terms of, I think it was the object over Lake Huron, there was comments on the fact that the first shot that was aimed at this unknown object missed. Could you go into details about where that object or where the missile landed, consequences of that? Just more details, please.
Okay, good. So thanks for the question, Mr. Chairman. The engagement of over Lake Huron on the 12th of February, which took place at around 2:42 p.m. or 14:42, carried out by F-16 with the latest AIM-9 Mike X-ray missile, was turned out that it required 2 missiles for the engagement. The first one was shot. Both of the missiles were shot from U.S. airspace, and the first one have been assessed as landing on the U.S. side of the border within Lake Huron.
And with all that risk assessment, even with it missing, that's all within those parameters of that risk assessment to civilians and,
Thanks for the follow-up question on Mr. Chairman. Definitely, like I mentioned, that we do risk assessment as it relates to the objects, i.e., there's an object, or in the case of the first event, the high altitude surveillance balloon from the PRC, risk assessment as it relates to the capability of the objects, and then after that, once a decision is made to actually engage the object, then a full-on risk assessment takes place with regard to the probability of success of that engagement with the different weapon system that we're going to use, and also with regard to the probability of when that object crashes or land or arrives on the ground for potential collateral damage to civilian infrastructure as well as people on the ground. So that's the second risk assessment that takes place. And I can tell you that discussion took place in NORAD, not only within the military circle, but also with the leadership of both countries.
And that completes our first 6-minute round. We're now on to the second round, 5 minutes. Madame Kramp-Nyman. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, and good morning to everyone. Certainly over the last several weeks, we have confirmed and learned that there's potential security threats to Canada, and we've learned that they're of major interest and concern to Canadians. There's no doubt it's created a tremendous amount of buzz and many, many questions. So thank you for being with us here today to provide some insight. So allow me to move forward. Major General Provo, during a briefing, you had mentioned at this time, I'll quote you, at this time, we were not asked to use CF-18s on any of those objects just because of where they were and where our resources in Canada were at the time. But there are capabilities on the CF-18 that will be able to take care of some of those objects depending on where they are and what they are. So my first question is, did the RCAF receive an order from NORAD or the CDS to shoot down any of the objects that violated Canadian airspace?
Okay, Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. Maybe I can clarify what I've said on the previous session. So on the object that was in Yukon, F-18s had been scrambled from Cold Lake to go and execute the order that both governments had made about this object. This object first transited from Alaska, where the decision had been made to engage that object, and then was transiting from Alaska to Yukon. At the time, we were in transition between the US fighters and the Canadian fighters that took off from Cold Lake. The F-18s from Cold Lake were minutes from being on site when we were able to take action with the American F-22 fighters. But this was about to be a handover between the US fighters and the Canadian fighters. And for NORAD, because the way we work, very binational in nature, you can see that the deputy commander of NORAD is a Canadian. All assets are always at the disposition of both governments, be it US or Canadian fighters, tankers, and surveillance airplanes. So on the one in Yukon, the F-18s had been scrambled. The F-18s had a good chance of taking an engagement there, but we elected to go with the first opportunity, which was the F-22, just as it crossed the border.
Okay, are you able to share exactly what the lack of resources were that prevented the RCAF CF-18 fighters from actually shooting down the balloon? What were they lacking in resources?
So the question, and General Pelletier talked a bit about that. So part of the assessment that's ongoing is, what is that threat? How is it made? What does it emit? The missile we're talking about here is an infrared missile. So is it hot enough? Is there a chance that we're going to have a shot on that? So that assessment happens as the object moves across. The F-18, we thought on that object would have been able to attempt it. It was going to be the first attempt from an F-18. And before taking that shot, there's a few tests we would have been able to see if we had a good shot on it. But
okay.
It did have an IR missile to take that object down.
And going back to your initial response, you spoke minutes. Do we know how many minutes? Was it 5 minutes, 2 minutes, 10 minutes?
I would say it's probably in the 5-minute range.
Okay.
Yeah, and if I may, Mr. Chair, I just want to highlight the fact that from NORAD, given the binational nature of the command, we're going to go for the best tool set that is available at the time, but also that is currently available. And in this conditions, given the changing environmental conditions and the desire to actually take it down as soon as possible, the asset that was on hand was the F-22. And I must also say that the best tool is not only the fighter, it's also the type of missiles. And every conditions based on radar cross-section, infrared signature may require a different tool set. And that's what we've seen in the difference between the high altitude surveillance balloon and the follow-on 3 objects that we've observed, is those were changing conditions that could have probably required different tool sets.
Perfect, thank you. So was there enough time to move our fighter jets to our forward operating locations to better position the RCAF to intercept the object?
Thanks for the question, Mr. Chair. So the time is always an element of factor. And the nice thing is Canada and NORAD doesn't have only the fighters, it's got the strategic tankers provided by both Canada and the US to actually carry out the mission. So in this case, the Canadian Air Defense sectors and the Canadian NORAD region, which looked at the disposition of fighter assets in the Canadian airspace, made the decision to actually keep the fighter in Cold Lake, to scramble from Cold Lake, which is the main operating base, which enabled easier sustainment. and leverage the strategic tanker to enable and to provide the reach required to achieve the intercept itself.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Grant Nyman. Mr. Fisher, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. I think of the phrase we used to hear all the time, inquiring minds want to know, and since these incidents, so many people are asking questions, and we don't really have answers. I know that NORAD, the CAF, Canadian government, the U.S. government keep holding briefings, but it just seems like there's so many unanswered questions, and I've listened to all the conversations going on here today, and it still seems like there's so many unanswered questions, and apologies if what I'm asking touches on some of the things that were already asked, but you've talked about, and I think it was General Peltier talked about the first balloon. What we kind of know what they can do and what they can't do, but can you just fill us in on what we don't know? What kind of challenges are facing us from finding out and getting answers to some of these questions? I picture I think you might have even touched on an update on the rubble, an update on finding the what's left of that first balloon, the Chinese surveillance balloon. So maybe you could just sort of touch us on an update of what's left to accomplish and what questions that you folks have, that NORAD has, that we're still trying to find out.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Chair. I'll start and then I'll pass it over to General Prévost. But the first thing of the unknown for us during the actual intercept phase of the objects were, again, characterization. Where's the object coming from? The objects we could not actually discernate or didn't have a visual on any form of registration on the object, which normally even hot air balloon or commercial aircraft, civilian aircraft will have registration to actually demonstrate the country of origin. Obviously, as I pointed out, the rate of closure of the fighters made for identifications of those registration mark very difficult, let alone that combined to low light conditions for 2 out of the 3 objects intercepts, and the capabilities of the payload that may have been carried by the object is also an element of high interest in order to actually not only assess surveillance capability, collection capability, but potential threat capabilities as well. General Prévost, you want to add on the what's left?
Yeah, so maybe what I'll add, there's many unanswered questions, like the member mentions. The one thing we know is that those 4 objects were unauthorized and unwanted. So that I think that we know. So we had to take action on them. The last 3 objects, it is true that we don't know exactly what they were, but they were unauthorized and unwanted. We're still searching for those objects where we have more questions, which are the one in Yukon and Alaska, and hopefully we'll find them so we can link or corroborate what these were. The one that was shot down over the coast of South Carolina there, we had a very good idea of what that was, because this has been observed in the Pacific before. But these things evolve. It's a scaffolding to which China can put a lot of arrays on. Many of those have been recovered, but they're still searching the water. There's still 2 naval ship and I think a U.S. Coast Guard ship that are trying to find the rest of it at the bottom of the ocean, but they've recovered already parts of it. Some of it we already knew. Some of it is going to be under analysis, and we'll let the U.S. disclose what that was when they're ready. Thank you.
Ms. Matheson, and I don't want to put words in her mouth, but she said something along the lines of all of a sudden we have all these objects in the sky. Is it, in your opinion, maybe just a heightened awareness after that first balloon that came from China that now has us out there looking? You talked about them being small and slow. It kind of reminds me of my hockey career, but is this something now where we've got a heightened awareness and we're looking for more of these things in the air?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Mr. Chair. So obviously, we always try to optimize sensors for the potential threat that may be coming, especially the ones on the approaches to North America. And in our case, sensors have been queued in order to actually detect long-range aviations. We've worked on sensors to actually detect potential cruise missiles, which is one of the predominant threats out there as seen in other regions. And now with the detection of the PRC IL-2 surveillance balloon in the around the end of January and early February, what we did is NORAD went back. We did data interpretation, data analysis, and we've actually tweaked what normally is called gate, but I'll use the word filter. The filter that we use to actually discriminate from just anomalies, radar anomalies, to be able to actually detect lower speed, lower radar cross section. Obviously, by lowering the gates or the filter, we end up with the risk of having more false contact, which happens because radar can actually detect potentially dust particles or birds that are traveling in wind, and that may lead to false contact. So that's an element that we're cognition of, and that we're going to be monitoring. But that tweaking of the radar is probably what enabled the detection of the follow-on objects in the last couple of weeks.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher. Madame Desbiens, 2.5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Ms. Desbiens, 2.5 minutes, please. Thank you, Chair. General Pelletier or General Prévost, at your convenience, in your opinion, is NORAD sufficiently well equipped to monitor the airspace? Or is there room for, you may say that there's room for improvement, but are you comfortable with the current equipment? Thank you for the question, Chair. Of course, as they say, the sky is the limit. There are always needs with regard to not only detection equipment, but other things such as fighter planes and planes that provide the fuel to them. And not only do we work with the tools that are provided to us, but we continue to transmit to the Canadian government and the U.S. government on an annual basis a list of needs. And these needs evolve, as I mentioned, depending on the threat that exists. There was a transition after September 11th where we had to adapt to this new internal threat through the use of commercial aircraft by terrorists. And we're now pivoting in order to be in a position to capture or detect and respond to the threat of cruise missiles, as I mentioned earlier. And through the modernization of NORAD, the Canadian government will provide us with additional tools in order to upgrade our ability to respond to the mission. And I spoke to the Canadian government, and the U.S. government also has announced in its budget last year the support and the adding of 4 trans-horizon radars, similar to what Canada will procure through NORAD modernization. So we are moving forward, but we don't stop. We keep expressing those needs to both governments in order to ensure that we will be in a position to respond to the threat now and those anticipated in the future.
Ms. Masson, 2.5 minutes.
You had, General Pelletier, you had mentioned, I believe, the increasing capabilities and the addition of Canada's F-35s into the capabilities of what we could detect. But it was my understanding, and certainly correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not as technically knowledgeable about these things, but it was my understanding that because with the first balloon detected and that high altitude, that it was only the F-22s that could reach that high up. So if you could actually explain what you meant by increasing the abilities through the F-35s, if they actually weren't useful in this instance, and how they would continue to could be useful going forward in these sorts of instances, especially considering it was such a high altitude and they weren't.
Okay, thanks for the question, Mr. Chair. So appreciate the interest in the F-35. Having worked on the project for a number of years, I can speak a little bit to that, and I'll see if General Prevost wants to add. Again, it's the usage of the right tool for the right unknown or objects that may be in both airspace. And at the end of the day, it's not only about the aircraft, it's also about the aircraft, its sensors, and its weapon package that we're able to actually tackle different threat being presented. For high altitude, the sensors on board of whether it's the F-22, F-35, F-16, and the CF-18, we're probably in a position to actually detect the high altitude balloon or a high altitude surveillance balloon or the objects that we've seen. The small radar cross section makes it challenging, but the vast or the multitude of sensors that are on board of the aircrafts now allows for cross-cueing on the specific threat or on the specific object that we're trying to intercept.
Sorry.
Once intercepts happen, sorry.
Sorry, just to clarify though, so the F-35, but it was told that the F-35 wouldn't have been able to do what was needed in terms of that first Chinese balloon. Just to clarify?
Very briefly, please.
I believe that the sensor of the F-35 would have enabled. I'm not going to talk about the maximum altitude to operate the F-35 here, because at the end of the day, the F-35 doesn't need, or any aircraft doesn't need, any fighter aircraft doesn't need to be co-altitude with the object because they can actually employ weapons that will actually make that altitude difference in if we decide to actually take out the objects.
Okay,
so
we're gonna have to,
in this case,
we're going to have to leave it there.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Matheson. Mr. Kelly, 5 minutes.
Thank you. Just I'd like a little more clarity again on the armaments of the CF-18 that and the CF-18s that were scrambled and the ones that we have the ability to scramble. Media reports have said that the AIM-9s have not arrived but were ordered 2 years ago. Were the armaments of the aircraft that were scrambled? In an earlier comment, you said that they were armed with missiles capable of that you believed were capable of striking and taking down a balloon, although there would have been tests if they were going to make the shot. So can you clarify the status of the CF-18's armaments?
Okay, I'll let General Prevost talk about the acquisition project. Or
Okay, thank you. So thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So the F-18s had been scrambled for the object that was shut down in Yukon. We had been scrambled on this one, and on board the F-18 were infrared missiles that we believe would have been able to take the shot. We don't know this because we never made it, and the decision was made to shoot it down using the F-22. Similarly, when the object came over Lake Huron, if the F-16s from the US would not have shut down that object, the F-18 had been scrambled from Bagotville on their way to take over from the US on this one. It had infrared missiles on board, and we believe we would have been able to take it. We'll never know because
Are these the missiles that had been ordered as an update to the CF-18 armament, or are these the older missiles?
So the F-18 has the AIM-9 Mike, which is a lesser version than the one that was used in the US, but we believe we would have been able to take a shot.
On the object that was shot down over Yukon, so this was tracked, you've said, and the American F-22s were in contact with it before it crossed the border. Why was it not shot down over American space?
Okay, thanks for the question, Mr. Chair. So the object was detected early, I'm going to say early morning, but in Yukon and Alaska, early morning is late morning for the folks in the lower 48 just because of a later sunrise. And so given the size of the object needed to be intercepted during daytime in order to actually be able to identify and characterize the object itself.
It was a question of waiting for sunrise. So is darkness part of a gap in our awareness and able to detect and identify threats to our airspace?
Thanks for the question. Darkness is maybe a challenge, depending on the speed, size, and characteristics of the object. Because with sensors on board of the different aircraft, there may be an ability to actually characterize, but it's also that ability is dependent on a number of factors to include infrared signatures and electro-optical characteristic as well. So in this case, in order to actually have a better characterization of the object and its potential package, we scramble fighters, and that scramble led to an intercept that was just before sunrise, and about 5 minutes after sunrise, that object crossed into Canadian airspace, and so that's why F-22 were on board, following and tracking the object.
There's an awful lot of darkness in the winter in these latitudes. That is somewhat troubling that there's such a short window. Just if that's part of the necessity of assessing whether or not there is a kinetic threat. And let me get to that point. Commander General Van Herk had, I guess, in earlier testimony we heard that he was confident that there was no kinetic threat on the first balloon, the PRC confirmed balloon that was shot down later. So if it was determined that there was no kinetic, how was he able to make that call so early? Can you walk us through how this happened?
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Very briefly, please.
Okay.
Sorry, very briefly, Mr. Kelly is beyond his time.
Okay, good. So assessment was made using a number of systems that are within NORAD and also within the commander's ability to use. And those systems, after a quick analysis of the potential payload that was underneath the structure, led the commander to his conclusion.
Mr. Kelly, Madame Lambropoulos, 5 minutes, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here to answer some of our questions on something that's been a big question mark for many people. And I think, as my colleagues mentioned, I think this is top of mind for Canadians right now. And so there's still a lot of question marks because we don't necessarily know what we're dealing with or where they're coming from. You mentioned how difficult it's been and it will be to recover the wreckage, especially because of the location and the fact that it fell over the Yukon and is now buried in snow. So it's possible that we won't be able to recover some of these or some of the parts, if at all. And so if that's the case, is there another way of learning about the origin, the capabilities, and the purpose of the object? Is there any other way, or do we really need to find this piece in order to answer some of these other questions?
Okay, thanks for the question, Mr. Chairman. Obviously, we're still doing data reduction of the radar contacts. The regions, the three different regions of NORAD involved with the intercepts are also doing video analysis. Obviously, those videos are at a higher classification than this forum, but those assessments are being done, as well as a better characterization of what, whether it's commercial, non-commercial, private usage of balloons are taking place in not only our airspace but across other airspaces as well, so as to better understand how many of these systems are probably in the airspace at any one time. General Prevost, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I think, Mr. Chairman, the members got it right. Until we find it, we won't be exactly sure what this was, where was it manufactured, where it came from. But like General Peltier mentioned, we're looking back as well at the radar. We know that 2 of those contacts came into Alaska from the Pacific. We just don't know what they were and where they were manufactured and how they got there. So we'd really like to find those things on the ground, and there's a lot of effort to find them on the ground to close some of those questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Why, in your opinion, would China use a balloon surveillance as opposed to a satellite or something else? Why is it, do you think, that they're using this specific object or these types of objects in order to enter our airspace and survey it?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Again, my view on this is that it is one of multiple sensors that could be used. One that they may have felt was not going to be detected, and one which may be a little bit more difficult to attribute as well in terms of launch locations and as well as capabilities and intent. So that may be one of the reasons, because we know that the PRC has a number of systems on orbit that have great capability, but those systems may not have the loiter time that high altitude balloon, surveillance balloon in this case, may bring about. General Prevost, anything that you would like to add?
Yeah, maybe what I would add is we have a good sense of what they are. Finding more on the ground will help close some of that gap. But I think we all know that China likes to push or challenge the international based order. China is more assertive in their foreign policy. China is also building military capabilities to assert that foreign policy. So we have to be concerned. And like I mentioned before, some of the answers we have is that object was unauthorized and unwanted. So we have to make more sense of this. We have to make sure we're prepared for this. That's all I'll answer for now.
Thank you. And I guess I know you've already touched a little bit on this. A couple of my colleagues asked similar questions, but why is it that it took for us to detect this balloon in order to fine tune or change the tuning of the radars in order to pick up on slower moving objects and smaller objects? And why is it, I mean, in the aftermath, is there a change in how we'll look at this going forward? Because I know that we mentioned that sometimes there's false contact because of the way that, we're able to see smaller things. Clearly it helped us find potential danger. So what is our outlook going forward?
That's an intriguing question, and I would really like to hear an answer too, but unfortunately Ms. Lambropoulos is out of time. But we are going to go for a third round, colleagues, and so maybe someone can raise that question during the third round. I have questioners, but I need advice from both the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party for the last two questioners in the third round. So with that, I'm going to call on Ms. Gallant for 5 minutes, please.
Okay, so the General said that NORAD provides a list of needs on a yearly basis to the U.S. and the Canadian government. I'd like to see that list is provided to the committee. Would that be possible, Mr. Chairman?
I don't know. That's up to we're going into some pretty sensitive areas, I should think. So I would appreciate guidance from General Peltier as to whether that is something that could be provided within the confines of your secrecy qualifications.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I missed the description of the list. I apologize.
The list that NORAD provides that it needs on a yearly basis to the U.S. and Canadian governments.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Chair, for the question and the request. Unfortunately, that list is classified, but we'll work with the command to actually provide potentially a declassified version of the list for the committee.
Thank you. Major General Prevost said they knew that the PRC surveillance balloon wasn't armed because NORAD had seen it over the Pacific before. Was that this specific balloon, or was it other specific or other balloons from the PRC similar to the one that had come over North America?
Okay, Mr. Chair, I'll take that one. So I believe what I said was that we understand what that high altitude balloon is because we've seen those over the Pacific before. So we understand where they're coming from, how they operate to a certain extent, and the fact that there's a large array, 30 meters long underneath with multiple sensors. So that's our understanding of it. The one that came over Alaska, to confirm what was on it, Joan Van Herk made the decision to go and intercept and take a visual and sensors identification of what's on there to ensure that he couldn't see any kinetic weapons that would pose a threat to Canadians or Americans.
And that was observed before NORAD detected them in our airspace?
Mr. Chair, that is correct. In 2021, some of those balloons had been flying over the Pacific.
So I'm trying to determine exactly when we first knew about this high altitude PRC balloon, because we've got the Washington Post on Tuesday and the Globe and Mail on Wednesday saying that the U.S. tracked the PRC spy balloon from its liftoff in Hainan Island, and then they observed it making a course change away from the Pacific military bases of the United States towards the mainland. So how is it that NORAD did not know about the high altitude balloon until it was over mainland North America? Or did they know?
Thanks for the question, Mr. Chair. Obviously, we detect using the sensors that we have, and as you pointed out, those lifted from the PRC or from the PRC. And lifting at different times using different wind models to actually carry the balloon, because what we've seen is those balloons and objects tend to actually just follow wind patterns at altitude, and that changes based on the altitude itself. For us, it became an element of interest, obviously, when the radar picked them up as the air surveillance balloon, or sorry, high altitude surveillance balloon started approaching the air defense identification zone. And so that's when we started attempting to actually characterize and looking at identifications for that system. So because there's a number of objects that actually transit through the Pacific for which, first of all, we may not be tracking because they're outside of our sensors, and because we don't consider them to be a threat to the airspace itself.
So we were told that you really didn't know what the payload was or its capabilities until you're able to take a look at the array that's being retrieved off the coast of South Carolina. Well, and then General Prevost said that he knew that there wasn't a danger, the hypersonic missiles, because they had known about them in the past, but they hadn't seen anything about them in the past several years. So, we have footage on the internet that shows the potential for a similar balloon carrying the hypersonic missiles. If they can't tell what the payload really was until they retrieve the arrays, how did they know when it was over the continental North America that there wasn't something dangerous to the population below as part of the payload?
That, too, may be an important question, but again, Ms. Gallant is out of time. Madame O'Connell, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you both for being here with us. Certainly a lot of Canadians, seeing the media here and in the U.S. have lots of questions. So I think this is helpful to go over some of these things. My first question is, have you detected or do you have any information that can be shared the first surveillance balloon from China? Do you have any indication that it was actually able to be remotely controlled, or was it truly a balloon in the sense that it was floating somewhat randomly?
Thanks for the question, Mr. Chair. We assess based on the analysis that was done of the image captures during the flight of the high altitude surveillance balloon that that balloon may have a capability, a limited capability for steering around the airspace. But we also assessed that the majority of the flight path was based on the ability of the balloon to just float and traverse the airspace using high altitude winds pattern.
Thank you. And in terms of the capabilities, certainly when this was first kind of progressing through media and we were learning about it in semi-real time probably, this idea that there was some commentary that Canada wasn't able to handle something like this on its own. And even we've heard a little bit about this here today, questioning, what can the CF-18s do? What are they not capable of? But I think again, to the benefit of any Canadian that is watching this, the benefit of what NORAD is and why it exists is this partnership to not have duplication in some respects. Obviously, each nation has to be able to defend its own sovereignty, but the whole purpose of NORAD is to actually be able to offer that North American alliance and that assistance so that, and it was discussed that the belief was the CF-18s could have handled this, but that an operational decision was made to go in a different direction. Could you perhaps elaborate on why that NORAD partnership exists and how Canada is not, or there isn't a lack of capabilities, that in fact this NORAD partnership is precisely why we are capable and able to handle any such threat or instance such as these flying objects and these high altitude balloons?
Thanks for the question, Mr. Chair. I couldn't agree more with the member's statement. Is that I've been in the Air Force and I've lived through NORAD since pretty much I started flying CF-18, and during that my career, but also during the NORAD 65th or 65 years of activity. NORAD has always been seen as an ecosystem of capabilities where the strength of both nations are brought together in order to actually achieve mission success. And so in this case, I don't see as a Canadian capability to conduct aerospace warning, aerospace control. I see a NORAD capability to conduct aerospace warning and aerospace control and maritime warning, as a matter of fact, as an additional mission that we have. In defense of Canada and the U.S. And the collaboration that exists in NORAD is what has made us successful. We're attempting still to this day with NORAD modernization activities by both countries to be as complementary as possible so that we don't end up pulling from additional resources from the countries, each of the respective countries, when we can actually be complementary and interoperable. So the people here at NORAD wearing either the Canadian or the U.S. uniform, as I always say, I'm agnostic to the flag. I care about the output and achieving mission success for both of our countries.
Thank you.
Bien, 2.5 minutes, c'est bon.
Ms. Desbiens, 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. We have learned through national networks Monday that NORAD had intercepted 4 Russian military aircraft near Alaska, but that North American airspace was not occupied. This event occurred in a context of a correlation with the presence of balloons in Alaska and this detection or interception, this context, the global context in which there is a war underway in particular, where one of the sides is unforeseeable, unpredictable. For NORAD, is that enough to be in a high alert state, a state of high alert that could justify both governments injecting more funding on a very short-term basis in order to improve your equipment? Thank you for the question, Chair. Of course, NORAD always remains in a state of vigilance. Our motto is we have the watch, and we have the watch 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, all year. So, of course, the interception of strategic Russian aircraft is a routine aspect for NORAD. We regularly see these incursions in the identification zone, not in the actual airspace, because, of course, entering into airspace would be a different matter. But on average, we have about seven interceptions of this kind per year, primarily from the Alaska region, but sometimes in the Arctic region and more rarely on the Atlantic coast, where these interceptions occur. So we have seen years in which there were up to 15 interceptions and years when there were none at all. So we remain watchful at a high level, particularly during this period of crisis in Europe, but we see these flights as routine training flights for the Russian Air Force.
Thank you. So the Americans and Biden, the Biden administration, they stated that their intelligence community developed the techniques to track and monitor these surveillance balloons last year. I was wondering, and you had just talked about the sharing of information, the fact that NORAD works with both, but the administration specifically stated that it was the Americans that delivered and monitored and developed this surveillance. So was that shared with NORAD? How is NORAD a part of that? How does that connect with the radar sat? And how were Canadians made aware of that intelligence? Was that shared? Can you explain that process?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll start, and John Prevost may add something with regard to our CF income capability, but I can tell you that we're fortunate that Canada is part of the consortium of Five Eyes country that actually contribute to the intelligence community. And here at NORAD, I get briefed on a regular basis by the staff within the intelligence division or directorate on upcoming events, element to be aware of, capabilities that are forthcoming, and the like at the different level of classification. So in this case, in terms of surveillance, obviously we monitor when there's an element that pops up that could could be of concern or pose a threat to the North American airspace. And at that point, I am made aware, just like the commander is made aware. John Prevost, anything from a CF Incom perspective?
I think the answer was good, Mr. Chair. Actually, the Five Eyes community is tracking those issues. Depending on, irrelevant of who owns the capability, the information is shared between the Five Eyes. We were tracking the intelligence community. We're tracking those balloons, and when it became a concern from North America, NORAD and Ottawa and Washington started talking. Thank you.
Mr. Kelly, 5 minutes, please.
So I'd like to just talk about the transparency aspect of this recent episode or series of episodes. The Canadian public was informed that that there was a transgression of Canadian airspace, largely from the announcements made to by the Americans, and when it was known that the object was over Montana, it obviously would have had to come over Canadian airspace, and although it would have been in American airspace even earlier, can either witness discuss what is considered normal, if there is a normal practice for informing the public of these kinds of episodes?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'll start off, and then I'll let Jean Prévost expand on the notification to the Canadian public. But I just want to highlight that part of our standard practice, and we continue to normalize practices as situation evolves. But part of our normal practice is if something happens in Canadian airspace, we obviously leverage the Canadian NORAD region to actually contribute to the NORAD headquarter operational picture. Then when there's an element of concern, because realize that once again, that's part of our process, which is to obviously detect and then track identifications and then characterize objects or unknown coming into the airspace. We need to do that, and so there's we're not out there on the social media platform saying, hey, we've detected something. The job for us is to get to an identification and characterization of potential unknowns, and so
Right.
that's what we do.
I understand, and I'm not making a criticism of the timing, but it is noted that sort of the minute that it hit the Montana border seemed to be the time that the world knew this was there. So I'm commenting: is there a difference in protocol between Canadian and American authority on this?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So I don't think that there's a difference in protocol. It's just that at that time, identification, characterization, and when the high altitude surveillance balloon, the first event, crossed into Montana, the proximity of that surveillance balloon to some more sensitive American system is probably what escalated the decision matrix to actually make the event public at that point. You need to realize that during the time of flight or the flight path, there was a desire by both countries to not only characterize but also understand and attempt from our end to also exploit, so that we could understand what were the objective and the intent behind the flight path of the surveillance balloon.
Do these kinds of surveillance balloons routinely fly over Taiwan?
Good question. I'll let General Prévost, because I'm focused on the North American airspace, and
a quick answer to that question, and then follow up and talk about
elaborate on that.
Yeah, about North American. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't have that answer.
Okay, it seems, and there had been reports that these that these balloons are frequently deployed there, and so we're left to wonder why NORAD maybe appears to be somewhat, at least, surprised by this, and that this is not something that is normally dealt with or anticipated within North American airspace. Is that a correct assessment?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Not that NORAD is surprised, because we monitor the evolution of systems that could potentially pose a threat or could be of concerns to both governments and military apparatus. But in this case, we obviously, once these systems approach North America, then this is where we start the standard process of the detection, track, and ID. So I wouldn't say we're not concerned or we have no interest. We monitor the evolution of systems, not only of high altitude surveillance balloon, but also other capabilities that may be in air or space, in the air or space domain, and for that matter, in the maritime domain as well, Mr. Chair.
Sorry, Mr. Kelly, but your time's up. Mr. May, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I will be sharing my time with you, the Honourable Chair. Gentlemen, thank you, first of all, for being here with us this morning. And thank you for the work that you're doing and continue to do. I'm going to shift gears a little bit because I think we've exhausted this topic to a certain extent. I really want to focus in on NORAD modernization. Obviously, we made the announcement in June to commit the better part of $40 billion to NORAD modernization over the next 20 years. I'm wondering, sir, if you could maybe elaborate on what we have done in recent months or years to modernize NORAD, and specifically what is coming, what capabilities do we need to invest in?
And thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. And first of all, I'm going to say that the modernization of NORAD starts not necessarily with capability, with the personnel, but rather with the personnel. They are the one here at NORAD across all three regions, whether Canadian or American, that really makes NORAD relevant to our competitors and adversaries. Because they're the one that always go above and beyond their own skill sets in order to actually do the mission that I've talked about earlier. But I truly appreciate the Canadian government's announcement as it relates to NORAD modernization to get after the number one priority of General Van Herk, that is domain awareness. What do we mean by domain awareness? It's having better understanding of what is in the Canadian-U.S. airspace or on the approaches to that Canadian-U.S. airspace, as well as the within the maritime domain from where threat may originate, given the ability of submarines and surface vessels to actually launch cruise missiles as well. So, and NORAD modernization is going to do just that. We believe that with the arrival of over-the-horizon radar, not only will it give us the ability to actually better sense inside the domestic airspace, but also on the approaches, and not only focused on the polar or Arctic avenue of approach, but in a 360 degrees ring, because NORAD modernization combined with the announcement of the U.S. to actually acquire 4 over-the-horizon radar will give us close to a 360-degree picture in order to actually better characterize element that may be on the approaches, to include over the Arctic Ocean as well, giving us not only that radius or azimuth, but also in terms of ranges. So that's one of the elements. The other piece is getting after modernizing our command and control system. Just like the Americans are doing across all of their services, is moving forward with new modernized command and control that can not only, that will enable NORAD not only to sense what's approaching, but also to make sense of the data that we've captured so that we're able to better and us as military make decision and enable our decision makers of both governments the required time to make those decisions.
In the few seconds that my colleague has provided, as I sit here and listen, I wonder whether we've looked at this from the wrong end. This seems to me to be a treasure trove of intelligence for the communist Chinese government. That they figured that they watch NORAD scramble. They know where you scramble from, what assets you put in play, the time on which it becomes public, etc. And I wonder whether and I doubt you can share this, I rather hope, though, that there will be some reflections on the extent of your domain awareness. Whether you have to tweak the current radar systems, but also that this may influence how you look at domain awareness in the future. I appreciate I'm asking a question that probably can't be answered in a public sphere, but it does strike me that the Chinese got a really good look at North American defenses, and they got it really cheap. The price of a balloon in the airspace, and watch how we scramble. So I just leave it with that because I'm already over time, and if I'm going to discipline colleagues, I have to discipline myself. Colleagues, I would think that we can go for one more 6-minute round, and then we'll call it a day. Is that acceptable? With that, I'll call on Mr. Bazan for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and you, of course, always have the Chair's prerogative to use more time if you
Monsieur le
need
Président,
to.
excusez-moi,
So
I know.
Excuse me, Chair.
Mr. Bazan. This is a chair joke here. Yeah.
So if you could just start the clock now. So just a question I think has been asked in the media as well. I think most of us have had the same question: is why would the communist regime in Beijing use a surveillance balloon versus the spy satellites that they already have? So in the professional opinion of both General Pelche and General Perot, what are we talking about as equipment, what you've been able to observe on this high altitude balloon that makes it important to the communist regime in Beijing versus what they can already pull out of off their satellites?
Thanks for the question, Mr. Chair, and I would have loved to answer the chairman's question, but I'll stick to the member's question.
Feel free.
I mentioned earlier, I think that there's an element of persistence and maybe proximity, because low Earth orbit satellites are still low Earth orbit, which is slightly more distance than the high altitude surveillance balloon. So that would be my first answer, but I would defer to the PRC themselves to literally answer the technical and capability questions. General Prevost?
Yeah, I think I could probably thank you for the question. I think I can probably link the chair's question and Member Bazan's question as well. There's clearly a surveillance gap that we don't understand, but there's probably better capabilities you can enjoy there. But I think more importantly, China is trying to figure out our limits, and this was an unwanted, unauthorized breach of our sovereignty. And they're probably wanting to know how much we're tolerant to that. And I think we've showed the response of how much tolerant we are with the breach of our sovereignty. So there's probably both there. That's me speculating, but for sure the response was there.
There's no question this was a provocation by the PRC, and we had to respond. But on the observation of the equipment that, the size of 2 or 3 city buses hanging underneath that balloon, were we able to determine whether or not they had a radio frequency and able to communicate back to Beijing, or was our ability to jam it, made sure that whatever it was collecting was stayed within the infrastructure on that platform, and that we're able to recover that now?
Good. Obviously, for reason of classification at this point, Mr. Chair, we're unable to actually answer that question. That's an analysis that is ongoing by, especially with the high altitude surveillance balloon, by the U.S. And we'll be standing by from a Canadian perspective for additional sharing. When in due time we'll be able to.
I appreciate that this is an unclassified briefing, so I appreciate that. Moving on, just to follow up on the previous question that was reported last week, NORAD intercepted 4 Russian military aircraft, fighter jets, Bear bombers, and coming up on Alaskan airspace. We used to hear quite regularly about Russian military aircraft approaching Canadian airspace, and that CF-18s had been scrambled to intercept. There hasn't been any reporting for quite some time. Is it because Russia is no longer coming into our air identification zone, or are we just not being transparent and reporting it back to the Canadian public?
And thanks for the question, Mr. Chair. I can tell you that transparency is the forefront of NORAD. We try to actually inform within the limits of operational security, obviously, the Canadian public of our activities so that they understand what we do and what the great Canadians and Americans within the lines here at NORAD do. Obviously, I don't drive the training plan of the Russian long-range aviation. There's been cycles, as I mentioned, we've seen up to 15 on an average of 6 to 7 intercepts a year. A good chunk of that, just by pure proximity, happens to be close to the Alaskan identification zone. But we've seen Russian activities that sometimes move on from the Alaska NORAD region to the Canadian NORAD region, to which CANAR has been very agile in responding, either by deploying directly from Cold Lake or moving fighters to one of our forward operating locations in the north. So we have seen it. It's just that in the last couple of months, the preponderance of the activities has been focused on the Alaska NORAD region.
So let's switch gears and following up on Mr. May's question about NORAD modernization. Because now, we've technically always been worried about Russian air excursions. But now with the People's Liberation Army in China becoming more aggressive, and now a new platform that we have to deal with. So how are we going to deal with changing our focus on the multiple levels of potential aerial threats and maritime threats that North America is facing? And when we talk about continental security, NORAD modernization, how are we going to change installing our over-the-horizon radar systems, updating our North Warning System, dealing with our, radar sat, and installing more low Earth orbit satellites to ensure that we can detect all of these threats, whether it's high altitude balloons that have potential to carry weapons, or fighter aircraft bombs, and of course, hypersonic missiles that we're starting to witness being used more and more.
Even with Mr. Bazan's additional free 17 seconds, he's way past time. I'm sorry.
Sorry about
that. Mr. Souza, 6 minutes, please.
No, I'll take it, Mr.
Okay, Mr. May.
I'll try to leave you a little bit more time this time.
Thank
if you
you.
wish to elaborate on your earlier question, Mr. Chair. And I was just saying to Mr. Souza, Mr. Bazan just stole my question, so this is perfect. If my question was going to be given the NORAD modernization strategy in the events of the last couple of weeks, what, if anything, has changed in that assessment of what we need, and obviously, if you want to answer Mr. Bazan's direct question as well.
Okay, thanks for the question. Actually, I'll roll all the chairman and the two members' question into hopefully an answer. Is first of all, General Van Erck expressed that Russia and China have been monitoring our activities for the last 20 years, while Canada and the U.S. were focused on counter-VEO, violent extremist organization abroad. And they've developed capabilities that challenges NORAD right now. We haven't talked about hypersonic vehicles and the advancement in cruise missiles, let alone, and that's only of the threat, but also the same thing with the delivery vehicles. So, and NORAD is monitoring closely with the intelligence community that evolution of capabilities. So that we're positioned to actually face that threat. So NORAD has done the pivot to not only focus on the north-south over the Arctic Russian potential threat, but we're also including Russia in our cross-check and in our planning as well, so that our plans are relevant to the threat of today and of tomorrow. John Van Erck has mentioned that Russia is the threat that we face right now, and China, with its capability, is only 5 to 7 years behind, and will be with capabilities that will threaten the North America in the near future. So that pivot has happened in our planning, and we're looking at not only our pure capabilities, that is fighters, missiles, tankers, airborne early warning capability, but also sensors and basing as well, so that we're posture in the future to be able to actually counter the threat, whether it be coming actually from Russia, from China, but through not only a lens of north or west, rather through a lens of 360 degrees and across all domain. Because even though our mission is focused on aerospace warning, aerospace control, and maritime warning, we're dependent on all domain information source to better understand and characterize potential adversaries' activities.
Thank you, General. And I believe my colleague, Mr. Fisher, might have a quick question.
Thank you, Mr. May. And General Pelche, I think you may have actually answered this question before I asked it. You talked about threats of today and threats of tomorrow and a pivot in planning. Is there a group sitting down now talking about these current events and coming up with a plan on a procedure on how to deal with something like this after this fourth one has occurred? Is this something that's happening now, a planning session on how to proceed in the future?
Thanks for the question, Mr. Chair. So right now, related to the current event in NORAD, there's been an assessment ongoing of the activities from not only an intelligence perspective, but also from an operational perspective that is involving the region involved. And that happened literally after the high altitude surveillance balloon and continued after the first object was detected and the one that was actually shot in Alaska. So there's a continuing assessment of the capabilities, but also of the procedures and process that we follow so that we can actually seamlessly execute, and that our information exchange with each of the respective national leadership is as seamless as we can make it. So it is happening. Plus, I had the privilege to be in Ottawa and having a discussion this week with a colleague, because at the end of the day, what makes us successful is not only us in uniform, but we're leveraging those interdepartmental colleagues in order to actually get us to mission success, which includes our collaborations with the Federal Aviation Administration in the U.S., NAV Canada, Transport Canada, and a number of other agencies and departments, so that we can actually deliver the mission.
We still have a minute left, Mr. Fisher. Charles?
Thank you again. To reaffirm the question by the chair, could this be a ruse by China to test our defenses and capabilities, given that it would be so obvious that we would see that it would be the balloon being out there would be caught pretty quickly? Could this be China testing us?
Thanks for the question. As discussed with by General Prévost and myself as well, I believe that that could be one of the options, especially as it relates to the high altitude surveillance balloon. Again, too early to tell with regard to the other three objects that were detected in terms of where they're coming from which countries, what is the capabilities and capacity and the intent behind the actual use itself. But I think that we shouldn't rule out options, and that we need to continue to look at, hey, how our daily activity response and postures and capabilities could be looked at and exploited in the future, because we have a tendency to think short term. Other nations have a tendency to look at their long-term postures as well.
Mr. Sousa, Madame Desbiens, 6 minutes.
Ms. Desbiens, 6 minutes. 6 minutes. Chair, what good fortune. Thank you, Chair. Allow me to imagine that you are perhaps of Quebec origin, given your last names and first names and the quality of your French. I'm very proud to have you among us and to know that you are perhaps from Quebec. So from that viewpoint, for Quebecers who are listening to us, you stated earlier that you observe and intercept quite frequently, 7 or 10 or sometimes 15 times a year, airplanes in the nearby airspace or inconvenient presence of foreign aircraft, particularly on the West Coast. What is it about the East Coast? Have you intercepted, have you done the same kind of operation, let's say, near Quebec or along the East Coast of the Americas? Thank you for the question, Chair. Yes, historically, we have also had interceptions that occurred along the East Coast or on the northeast flank of NORAD, near the archipelago in the north, which is why we also maintain operational bases that are advanced. The term is FOL, Forward Operating Locations, which enable us to respond to those incursions of the identification space, not the immediate airspace of Canada and the United States. And those bases enable us to respond on the East Coast, on the northeast flank or northeast, or on the West Coast. And we have seen some of them were mainly on the West Coast and not directly in Alaska back in around 2014, 2015, as I recall. And since that time, there have been no more suspicious observations on the Quebec side or north of Quebec. More suspect observations, no. The description of these aircraft that approach our coasts, it's not only the type of aircraft, it's whether the aircraft is armed, whether what is the behavior of the aircraft. Do they have threatening behavior? And we also analyze intelligence of the previous weeks and months to ensure whether there is not some hostile intent, whether against Canada or the United States. So this analysis is done on a regular basis every time strategic resources are deployed by Russia or by any other nation that might approach Canada and the United States. Thank you for your answer. Either General Prévost or General Pelletier, as elected officials, we have an opportunity sometimes to speak, to question the government on its intentions, on its plans, on the amounts it wants to invest in the future for security of our territory. So we're coming to the end of this 2-hour period spent with you. What would be your recommendations to the members of Parliament who are here? What can we do to support you and to carry your message further? Do you have any specific request or imminent or more urgent need that could result in our mobilizing one another in order to put across your message? I know that you can probably put your message across quite directly, but we also have a job to do as parliamentarians, so I'm ready to hear you. Thank you for the question, Chair. Clearly, we have had an opportunity, a privilege to welcome members of the Senate last month here in NORAD, or last week in NORAD, and I'd like to express that I appreciate the interest that the members of the committee have regarding the issue of national defense and also NORAD's capacities connected with continental defense and defense at large, to use that expression. So the first point is thank you for your interest. What's important for us is to have people understand our mission and this wish for transparency with the members of the committee. I think that what Canadians need to understand is that the threat continues to evolve. We are in an operational environment that is quite complex around the world, and we need to continue and to focus on this complex environment as regards the threat that it might involve, not only directly in Canada, but also this system, the democratic system that we live in and that we prefer. And for that purpose, of course, we need to continue looking at the needs so that the Canadian forces and NORAD can fulfill their mission and what the Canadian government has done so far with the announcement of NORAD. It's an information aspect so that people can understand the mission, the limitations, but also the progress that we recommend so that Canadians, Americans on the mission here can continue to deliver according to the expectations of the Canadian people.
To the NDP, 6 minutes.
Amazing. A lot of my questions, actually, they were brought up by the chair, by my other colleagues, in fact, of that test of China, or the Chinese government, how they're watching our speed of reaction, the processes we use, how we act, but how we also communicate. So how does this, if this is the thought process of what we have to be aware of and careful of, how do we ensure that we continually remain transparent to the Canadian public? I know that there's a lot of information going back and forth. There was a lot of confusion. It's led to the confusion here and our many questions. But how do we ensure that that transparency is maintained, that clarity, that... But I'd also like to throw in there, in terms of our reaction, the Chinese government has responded saying, you know, these are not hostile balloons. Our seemingly somewhat hostile reaction, or is it seen as a hostile reaction? What does that do to the overall level between both of our, well, the NORAD group, but the Chinese government? And how do we factor that into, or how does NORAD and the decisions that are made, how do we factor those into those risk assessments that you had talked about earlier?
So thanks, Mr. Chair. Given the angle of the members' question with regard to international affair and the transparency of the department, I'll let General Prevost start, and I may add after, Paul.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. So the first on the question of transparency, we're as transparent as we can. Sometimes as these operations unfold, there's an element of operation security, but you've seen this week that we've talked to you about the Russian incursions in the north. We started talking about the balloon when it started really to be of concern to NORAD, the United States and Canada. So we're committed to transparency. On the issue of China coming here, I think I've expressed it already. They're pushing the bubble. There's no doubt that this was a breach of sovereignty. Obviously, we're going to try to have more discussions with China when we find more about this, what was exactly on this balloon. But we're committed to transparency to Canadians. We obviously will try to have discussions with China on that. Those discussions occurred already. We saw what their answer was of being non-hostile. But for sure, there was a breach of sovereignty, and we needed to assert our sovereignty. And I think that's what happened both in Canada and the U.S.
Good. And so I'll add the element of the NORAD headquarters towards transparency to both government and to both military apparatus in the U.S. and Canada. And that's part of our inherent process. We exercise on a daily, weekly, not only at the tactical level, but all the way up to me and the commander on activities such as Operation Noble Eagle following 9/11 and the like. And those exercises are so that the passage of info is made as early as possible to the right level of government, so that we provide our decision maker with key decision time to assess the situation and provide directions as required.
In terms of, you had referenced the bit of that tolerance test for what we're willing to see or how we're willing to deal with these things, these unknown objects. In the press conference yesterday, I believe President Biden was saying that that they are reviewing these processes. You, General Pelche, mentioned this review consistently from the very first incident of reviewing the processes going forward, how we deal with them. Biden had suggested that that potentially there are other avenues that we could take. Could you explain a bit more? Is our only opportunity or to stop these unknown objects because of the threat and that level of risk to shoot them down? Are there other alternatives? And I consider that in terms of the fact that when NORAD or our allies did shoot down specifically the unknown object over Lake Huron, that first missile missed. And so what are the other opportunities that we have to stop?
Okay, thanks, Mr. Chair, for the question. I can assure you that we look at the depth of the tool bag and assess what's possible, all the way up short of the kinetic, i.e., the missile or gun employment, as we're always trying to actually minimize the collateral damage, not only from the use of a weapon, but also because of the follow-on impact of potential debris on the ground. So that's part of our element. We look at the tool bag, and that may include a non-kinetic capability. But in this event, the best tool available to NORAD at the time was the use of fighters and of the specific AIM-9X missile. So, but we're not stopping short. We're going to continue to actually look at what else is required to carry out the mission.
Thank you, Ms. Matheson. And on behalf of the committee, I wanted to thank Generals Pelche and Prevost for their appearance before this committee, the fulsomeness of your answers within the limitations that you operate, and I particularly appreciate putting facts into the public realm so that discourse in the public realm is informed by fact as opposed to fantasy and conspiracy theories, et cetera. So that this 2 hours alone is useful to inform public dialogue, and we appreciate it. And I anticipate that we will likely see you again before the committee. But again, we can't thank you enough for your appearance here. Colleagues, before we adjourn, we need a little bit of housekeeping. We need to pass the budget for the conspiracy. Yes, the cyber study. Yes. I get all my news from a certain television station. You've all received this electronically. It's about $9,000. Is that correct?
$11,450.
Okay. For that study, I need a motion to Mr. May, seconder, Mr. Kelly. Any debate? Seeing none, motion pass. Thank you very much. And colleagues, have a good week. Is it 2 weeks?
2 weeks, yeah.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.